So, dear Irina, thank you very much for your time for this interview. I hope we can explain a lot of geopolitical topics, not in these 20 minutes, but I guess we are going to open up some new perspectives on the global scale. So, first of all, I want to ask you about this Israel and Palestinian situation. I mean, we saw the ceasefire for a while, but now it's everything again and maybe even worse. And I guess the audience, I mean, the public is really disturbed in the world. What can we expect in the future?
Right now, it's a very complicated situation because over the weekend there were intense negotiations. Hamas' proposal was to release half of the remaining hostages, and it's not clear whether they meant half of the living hostages, which is approximately 20 people, or could be a little bit more than that, or half of whoever they have in totality, in exchange for a 2 month ceasefire. Now, the problem with the 2 month ceasefire is that when the Israeli troops have abandoned particular areas, Hamas comes back and they retake all the civilian sites there and they retake all their positions. And it's as if nothing, all the clearing activities have not taken place. So Israel rejected that offer, and they gave their own counter offer, which Hamas in turn rejected as well. So Israel started a new offensive called Gideon's Chariots. At the same time, they restarted humanitarian aid, which consists of Israeli cooperation with US-backed private groups to distribute aid to the Gazans under heavy pressure from the United States. Now, initially, the Trump administration was not particularly big on this aid scenario. In fact, they actually cut aid to Gaza, along with everywhere else around the world. But they later readjusted their expectations, and they not only restored some of their own aid, but have pressured Israel to bring the aid in. Now, the issue is not that Israel was blocking the passage to aid. The problem was the distribution, which Hamas has been confiscating from the locals. So the idea now with this new arrangement is that the way the aid will be distributed, it will bypass Hamas and will deliver aid directly to the civilian population, or at least minimize some of the stealing. I don't know whether that's the case. Gazan activists are pushing for airdrops because they are relatively low cost, effective, and at least give an opportunity for someone to grab something. Whereas even humanitarian groups can be fooled by Hamas wearing civilian clothes and taking up the aid. So that is a complicated issue that is not easy to solve regardless of who is involved, and we've seen that throughout the war, and we've seen that previously. This is not something new. The only new thing is the arrangement and the way the administration is reacting to it. What is more difficult is the offensive itself, and whether there is an end game there, because Israel threatened to occupy certain parts of Gaza and clear them from Hamas presence, and essentially the idea of this offensive is to bring about the military downfall of the remainder of Hamas leadership in Gaza. And the reason some speculate that the reason Hamas agreed to the weekend talks was because the third Sinwar brother Mohammed was killed in an Israeli airstrike, and he was one of the operational Hamas leadership who was taking charge of the operations right before and at the end of the week. But of course, these people are very easily replaceable. Hamas is constantly recruiting. Without a clear plan in place, I don't really see how that situation can be resolved. Now, there's been rumors that supposedly Netanyahu is trying to force Gazans of any background, Hamas and non-Hamas, out of Gaza in order to be able to create a buffer zone and also to create a space which will guarantee no Hamas presence. Um, so people are claiming that you can't just force civilians out. If you want to force Hamas out, then you have to figure out how to separate Hamas from civilians. So not clear how that's going to work. What's also not clear is what the administration expects to happen, because on the one hand, there are rumors that the administration has been talking to Libyan government. I don't know which one, given that there are two, but but one or both of the governments about taking in 1 million Palestinians. So where they're getting that number, how they're going to convince all these people to leave, it's not how they're going to ensure that Hamas doesn't make it into another foreign country. There's nothing, none of these details is available. But what is clear is that on some level, the administration has to understand that for that to happen, Israel has to get rid of Hamas first. At the same time, J.D. Vance, who was supposed to be in Israel this week, canceled this trip. And the latest is that the reason he did that is because he doesn't want to be seen as the administration encouraging the new offensive. And that's after Trump had repeatedly said that the natural consequence of Hamas intransigency would be this sort of, very violent scenario, which is exactly what's occurring. So there was this sense that the administration was, at the very least, not opposed to Israeli actions because they saw it as internal business, and because as long as U.S. didn't have to be involved in all of that, they didn't mind that Israel would take defensive action to address Hamas. Now, however, we're getting a very different message, and the fact that J.D. Vance or J.D. Vance's people leaked this information to a reporter underscores that the administration is not all united about Israeli strategy in Gaza, and it's also not clear what they want to, the Trump administration itself does want to have economic opportunities in Gaza, and President Trump said so repeatedly, but how that would occur without an offensive that would, at the very least, dislodge Hamas is also unclear. At the same time, the question of the civilians, of the non-Hamas population, and what would happen to it, no one seems to have a clear plan. There's also an increasing uprisings against Hamas itself, and not just for economic reasons, but specifically because Hamas ended up dragging Gaza into war and leading everyone through.
We
It
saw
is
some
true
kind
that.
of accusations about European Union is helping Israel and America is helping Israel. So it's quite difficult to understand how can Europe be on the every side of the wars. I mean, they have its own war in Europe. I mean, they are helping there. They are trying to make some kind of defense strategy now. I mean, today was meeting like in UK, European Union, and Vice President Vance. And what can we expect from that kind of meeting? And what is the strategy? I mean, they can't be on every side.
Well, the biggest takeaway is that the US administration is talking about withdrawing all of its troops from Europe. Now, previously, there were talks about relocating German bases to Hungary, but now it seems to be an even more radical strategy of withdrawing all the US troops, or most of them, from European bases, including Poland, and which would leave NATO effectively without US military support, maybe with logistics and some financials, and that's about it, but effectively without US presence. So, of course, that would affect both continental Europe and the United Kingdom, and which is why we're seeing these summits. It's the administration has not actually made a very clear position on anything. It's not clear what's going to happen. The US is somewhat still pushing the peace plan between Russia and Ukraine, but at the same time threatening to withdraw. And it has done so repeatedly, and at one point it did appear to have withdrawn. But it seems to be still very active, at least behind the scenes, in the negotiations. After Putin did not show up in Istanbul for the meeting, Trump basically said that only a direct meeting with him would resolve the situation, but it's not clear how or why that would occur.
So everything is unknown for now.
Yes, but the thing is, I don't think J.D. Vance has a clear plan either. I think he is basically the isolationist wing of the administration, and likely to hold a hardline position on the demands. Let's recall that Elon Musk and other Trump affiliates had also interfered in the British elections just recently, pushing for the Reform Party, which made significant gains in the midterm local elections. Don't know whether it's due to the US support or just due to the ineptitude of the major leading parties, or whether it's a combination of several different factors, which is most likely the case. But we are seeing that on the one hand, Trump has praised Prime Minister Starmer as a person and had a positive dynamic with him in his meeting. But on the other hand, U.S. seems to be opposed to the general European position on Russia, on tariffs, on everything else. And the deal with the UK was essentially a non-deal. It just preserves the status quo, freezing it in place without letting the tariffs rise beyond what is currently, in July when the 90 days deadline expires. So there's also UK is also part of the Five Eyes. So the intelligence cooperation is very much in flux due to the actions of the US recently and its intelligence positions and who is in charge of that. So there's a lot of unclear questions about the way US-UK relations are going. When you bring in the European Union factor, it gets even more hairy because, as my, the relationship with the UK is not yet directly toxic, but the relationship with the European Union very much is. J.D. Vance has repeatedly attacked Brussels, attacked various countries in the European Union, and while the Europeans are trying to use an opportunity to find some sort of constructive path forward, it's very clear that there's a very divergent strategy. US is very much heading in a pro-Russia, pro-Iran position and excludes European Union from major strategic decisions, whether on the Middle East, with Syria, with Iran negotiations, or with Russia and its role. There's also no direct talks on the issue of Gaza either. So whatever European is doing there is entirely separate and not coordinated with Washington.
Can U.S. solve the problems with China? We saw the tariffs and we saw the tensions going on because of the Taiwan and that kind of issues over there in that part of the world. But also we can see that U.S. government now want to make some kind of better deals and better communication with Russia. And also, we know that Russia and China are in one kind of block. So, what is happening? What is the balance between those things?
Just to be clear, the Trump administration does not see China as a national security threat per se. Some members of it may be, but the overall position views China as a geopolitical competitor and rival, which puts it in the framework of economic response, but not necessarily a top national security threat. Different position from NATO, which within the last couple of years did shift to consider China a national security threat. But individually and independently, Washington is not really treating China that way. And we can see that from the TikTok non-decision. The Congress voted to essentially force a sale or to ban the TikTok operations in the US, and Trump keeps giving it an extended lifeline. So we are seeing that from the security perspective, there isn't a big concern about China. There is a concern about its financial activities and its competition. And access to resources, but there are also some who are claiming that the Trump strategy is to try to detach Russia from China, but I don't see that either. There is a lot of distrust between Russia and China on operational level, meaning intelligence level and other activities, but rhetorically, at least, Russia is actually catering to China a lot now. Dugin's pan-Eurasianism is essentially a acknowledging the Mongolian invasion as something positive, which feeds into very much into China's strategy and potentially its territorial claims to parts of what is currently Russian territory. So all of that, from Russia's standpoint, is not a big deal compared to its more immediate geopolitical plans. And China, for the same reason, views Russia potentially as toxic from an economic standpoint, but from a national security standpoint, regards it as an important weapon against the West. And is not going anywhere. And I don't see any clear strategy to increase the enmity and the tensions between these two countries. I don't see them being played one against the other, really, not by Congress and not by the United States. To the extent there's been threats against Russia in an attempt to crack down on some economic things, it really has nothing to do with China. That hasn't been done already previously. So I'm not entirely sure that there is a strategy beyond US just trying to make transactions and lucrative deals whenever possible and seeing what it can get out of each country. And right now, Russia seems to be gaining a lot of political capital very quickly from the US in the sense of strategic communications, legitimacy, and nuts, if not directly financially, without having to do much or anything in return. With China, the situation is a little different because there are some expectations of economic tensions, and the tariffs did cause damage to both U.S. and Chinese economy. But at the end of the day, it is Trump who blinked and essentially. By reducing tariffs and by not coordinating with other allies, failed to isolate China completely. And I don't really see that changing anytime soon because Trump's ultimate goal with those tariffs was not necessarily to bankrupt China or to diminish its global influence, but rather to gain symbolic victories that he can boast about, even if they're not really victories and even if they're entirely avoidable and self-created, and also perhaps to make money off the volatility resulting from the markets.
There are a lot of controversies now because if European Union want to create more weapon, like more defense, they are more affecting like the environment and climate, and they're using more fossil fuels and etc. etc. I mean, there is a lot of talk about losing trust. People are losing trust in the politicians, not just in the European Union, but all over the world in a way. I mean, the Middle East situation can make like big migrations to Europe, and that can make even more tension, even more unsatisfied people. What can we do to save democracy in a global level?
Look, there has been unquestionably a leadership crisis everywhere. And to the extent that Europe is finally starting to wake up to geopolitical realities, it's still not acting in a forward looking way, it's still acting in a reactive way. Even the defense industry moves and the assistance to Ukraine is reactive rather than proactive. All of that should have been done a lot sooner, a lot quicker. The capacity building individually is going to take some time. And moreover, there's a very I would say straight line thinking rather than lateral thinking on global threats such as China and Russia. There's a big lack of creative thinking. At the same time, European countries are still acting delusional on issues which are driving people to pro-Russian candidates in the first place. One of them being the green energy scam. What I mean by scam is not that the green energy is bad. It's not that there shouldn't be innovation and cleaner environmental standards and better technologies. And everybody is very much pro all those things, and nobody is going to deny that the more diverse you have an energy and technology environment, the better it is for people. Everyone likes to have options, but elevating environmental issues to the top national security and global threats above literally everything else, including your own economy, including dependency on Russian gas, including all of these things, is sheer delusion, and it smacks of corruption, frankly. And the fact that it's still going on after everything that we've seen over the past 3 years is the reason why a lot of people are disillusioned, and they are grasping for even bad solutions as an alternative to what they see as arrogance from their political leadership. I'm not saying that the bureaucracy in Brussels is in any way comparable to the destruction wreaked by Russia. I am saying, however, that people who are living in Europe and seeing that their vote and their concerns are being systematically ignored are going to be pushed into making the wrong decisions and choose the worst of the two evils simply because they want something different and they want to feel like they're heard, and the populist candidates pushing the pro-Russian or pro-Chinese line do use the rhetoric that makes it sound like they're hearing the people. This is exactly what happened with the Trump administration and how they came to power. So yes, with all of that, I would still agree that European Union and Europeans and Western countries in general are by far the better options compared to dictatorships and corrupt regimes. But they have a lot of growing up to do if they want to be effective against standing up to these regimes, and if they want to show that they have more to offer than kind of middle of the road stagnated semi soft corruption that many people are starting to resent, the stifling of innovation by over regulating, the killing of national pride in these countries. You can have patriotism and national pride and appreciate your history without going into this extreme level of quasi imperialist admiration and isolationism that these populist parties are pushing, and this is the balance that Europe needs to regain. And I think all the wrong lessons are being learned. This Europe has been going from one extreme to another. Brexit, for instance, was very much based in legitimate grievances and concerns, but the way it was handled, first of all, was politically incompetent, and second, Russia had a lot of influence on the process, which caused unnecessary tensions and weakened cooperation against real threats. And now what we're seeing is that the same things are being relitigated in a way that does not address the initial grievances to begin with. So you're kind of returning to the same process in reaction to the anti-Russian concerns, but without taking into considerations the lessons learned from initial failings. This is the problem that the West needs to realize. This is the leadership crisis I'm talking about. No one expects people to be perfect, to know everything immediately, but if you're not learning lessons, if you're not adjusting yourself to the realities, you're going to be taken advantage of by people who are unscrupulous, who don't have anything to lose, and who are noting your every misstep and amplifying it a thousandfold, which is what Russian, Chinese, and other trolls are doing, and influencing elections and causing all of these things. So why is there such a leadership crisis? Why are Western countries not producing more exciting, more creative thinking in the political class? Frankly, this is not an easy answer because it's a problem made in the decades. It's not something that started today or yesterday. It's a problem with education. It's a problem with the political systems. It's a problem with the regulations and anti-corruption mechanisms. It's the problem with political culture. There's a lot of different elements, but it's not an unavoidable problem. And I think there is a lot of room for younger generations to do better.
For example, when you said young generations in Serbia, at the moment we have like 6 months protest of our students on the streets. They went with bikes to Strasbourg, and when they went like running to Brussels to send that political message. I must say political because that's political issue in our country. I mean, the first of all, the fall of the canopy at the railroad station and more. So for example, you said young people need to have better education about, in a way, new diplomacy. You said that problem is present in about 10 years and that world need Geopolitical scene need a new diplomacy. What kind of diplomacy we can use for making better relations? I mean, we can see that this is like energy war. Everybody's fighting for energy resources, and how can we make a better diplomacy to share and to make a better place?
Actually, real diplomacy is all about effective communication. The problem is we're seeing a huge divide between the political class. I hate the word elites because anyone who ends up being winning ends up being the elite, even if they start out as opposition or minority or whatever. So I really don't like that word. But anyone, between political leadership or economic leadership and the, lay people, um, voting population, I would say there's a huge disconnect. There is no clear communication. In the US, town halls used to be a very prominent part of the discussion. So US is not a direct democracy, but the town hall structure used to give an opportunity for constituents to talk directly to their representatives, to ask tough questions, to express their grievances to be heard, and to adjust accordingly. We need a lot more of that in Europe and elsewhere, and frankly, we need to go back to that in the US. The climate has become so polarized that it's difficult to have a civil conversation and to have an informed conversation and to have a multi-sided, multilateral conversation where different points of view are respected and taken into consideration, and there is a balance between majoritarian and minority points of view. So there's a failure in managing this process, but nevertheless, the process itself is quite important. So that needs to happen. There needs to be this sort of dialogue about key issues that can concern everybody, and energy resources and things like AI and cybersecurity and the role of big tech corporations and their role in governance. All of these things should be debated. It shouldn't be, a decision from the top by decree. This is the regulatory structure, and this is what happens. And you have to comply. And if you don't comply, you get fined, and that's it. There needs to be a debate, and there's a huge disconnect between Europe and the U.S. regarding a lot of these regulatory practices, which I think has become rather toxic and completely unnecessary. I understand that there's also all sorts of financial considerations and power plays underlying all of that, but it really doesn't help anyone. Even people communicating more between each other and exchanging ideas and cooperating, and not rather, fighting over scraps in a way that stagnates innovation and stagnates discussion. And this is what we're seeing. There is no real debate between European and American populations except on individual cases. Scientific collaborations and cultural collaborations used to be overcome that cultural divide, but really there's no disconnect. This is why people like G. Vance have these absolutely ridiculous notions about Europe, that it's not a democracy at all. No, it's a challenged democracy. It's an imperfect democracy. There's a lot to criticize and to question, but to claim that it's somehow equivalent to Russia or to China is absurd. And it happens when Americans don't travel and when they don't have much interaction with a lot of different people from different backgrounds. And Europeans travel to the United States, but they also seem to have this sort of, they also mostly travel to a few big cities. They don't engage with average Americans from flyover countries, they call it. So there's also this semi-elitist perspective that also is not helpful. And frankly, if you are concerned that the flyover people are not educated about the rest of the world, the worst thing you can do is not talk to them, and that actually feeds into this lack of perceived, ignorance. So this lack of perceived education. So we need more initiatives that bring people together, and fewer initiatives simply stereotyping each other over political culture and structure. After all, average people are not necessarily all politically involved or know what's going on with their governments or have any way to control it, but they do want to do things better and to talk to others and find ways of managing and exchanging ideas and seeing how they can learn from each other's best and worst practices.
Talking about average people, what kind of atmosphere among the average people is in US?
Very, very polarized, but the majority of people are inherently supportive of Ukraine and not supportive of Vladimir Putin. even most Republicans. The MAGA component is a small but extremely loud portion of the country, which has managed to gain a hold of political process by taking over primaries, where most party members don't vote, only the most active members of the party vote, and by stacking assorted political mechanisms with loyalists and activists. So essentially, it's not that the majority of Republicans have suddenly gone insane or gone insane over years, but that the leadership has been taken over by a particular faction, and everybody else felt either opportunistic or helpless to challenge the status quo. And I think that's starting to change because things like tariffs are hitting even the MAGA supporters who thought that these processes would actually help them and who are seeing the actual impact on the ground. The fact that their businesses are shutting down, they're losing jobs, and things are getting more expensive and less readily available. Even if one particular industry gets protected, your life, even if you're working in that industry, is not defined by just where you work. It's defined by everything, by many industries. And that's why even people who are quote unquote protected are not feeling great about the situation right now. And of course, the fact that it's the economy that it's the biggest hitting factor as opposed to uh, anti-democratic rhetoric, conspiracy theories, you can complain about it, but that's a reality and that's a start. The fact that even hardcore supporters of some of these processes who were willing to overlook a lot of troublesome themes in the Trump candidacy are now starting to question, may lead them to question everything and not just these not just the economic impact. But I have to warn everyone once again about the pendulum situation. The fact that when you have an extreme candidate in office and who disregards the opposition and who acts from a position of extreme arrogance, and we have seen that from the Obama administration and then from Trump administration and from to some extent the Biden administration and not back to Trump. So basically, since for the past almost 20 years, we have seen that sort of governance or unilateral arrogant governance. The pendulum will swing not to the center, not to the middle, not to a more reasonable, but to the more extreme. So there's a warning that a Trump will be followed by an AOC, an extreme leftist with even more destructive ideas about the economy, about social life, and about foreign policy. Who in some ways has actually a lot more common with Trump than she realizes, but who will never admit to that. So if we don't want to keep going back and forth between these candidates who are taking the country more and more to the extreme ways and destroying our relationships with our allies and with anybody else, really, and with ourselves, there needs to be a very hard rethink on how we approach politics, how we approach campaigns, how we approach political discourse, information, and information space. And I don't see a lot of that. I see a lot of discontinued sarcastic online activity and dehumanizing activity, and not a lot of effort to push back to the classical liberal tolerant structure that was sort of underlying US and kept it going for the past decades. Look, Washington has always been dysfunctional for many decades, but even that is not too late to reset because we have seen the products of these policies which have brought us to this place now. We are seeing blatant corruption, think tanks, media, and even the president being on the payroll of foreign regimes. This is not normal. US can become a very prosperous country without those things. You don't, if you have to depend on some foreign, monarchy for your livelihood, and that's all you have, you have to rethink how you're governing.
Dear Irina, thank you very much for your time and for this interview.
Thank you. This was quite a delight.